Well, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be able to present some of my work and share some of the things happening in our center with you. And I only wish I could be there in person. In January of this year, we announced a new center, the Center for Constructive Communication, which grew out of work we're doing at the Media Lab based at MIT. And the center grows out of years of work we've been doing that really is responsive to a fundamental challenge that we started to study in an American context, but clearly which has a kind of global footprint. And that is that everywhere we look, in politics and the workplace, in mainstream media, on the airwaves and online, on the streets, and even sometimes at home, we're sensing an alarming sense of social fracture and fragmentation. The breakdowns of social trust that are speeding the erosion of shared truths. There's the tribalism that breaks connections between and among communities. And the internet and mass media and social media all amplifying and extreme and divisive voices is creating a kind of sense of almost overwhelming challenge. Some of the work that led us to sort of centering on this challenge, I want to share with you just two examples. In 2018, we published an analysis that looked at the spread of false and true news, contested news. The visualization you're seeing here shows in orange a cascade through Twitter of what turned out after fact-checking to be a false piece of news, in blue, a piece of true news that was contested. And what we actually found over the course of the entire history of Twitter up to that point was a really dramatic difference in how false news spreads further and faster than true news, and that it was not just a result of the algorithms or bots, but in particular, it seemed to be kind of human intuition, sort of in the moment, kind of in response to emotions, perhaps of surprise and disgust that lead to these kinds of propagation of false information. A second piece of information, even of research that goes back even further to the 2016 US presidential election, really became symbolic of the kind of fragmentation that we're facing, was this picture that you're seeing is of a subset of users on Twitter that are color-coded by their political affinity. In red, followers of candidate Donald Trump. This was in the fall of 2016 before the election. In blue, along the margins, you can see followers of Hillary Clinton, and in green, Sanders. So first of all, this is a picture, we think, of poor health of a highly fragmented network where the Trump followers have very thin connections to the rest of the electorate, at least a sample on Twitter. And when we expose the location of journalists and these thousands of journalists that are shown here pulsating in blue, these are verified journalists by Twitter, and yellow unverified journalists, we see that across the political spectrum, media spectrum, the journalists themselves are disconnected in their personal networks from a very large and what turned out to be significant part of the electorate. So this kind of analysis of large-scale networks and the diffusion of information, when you go down to the ground level and say, so what's it like in the public spaces that dominate our world today, we really have created a mainstream and a social media ecosystem where shouting and extreme reactive points of view that are disconnected from everyday life and that lead to a very divisive kind of dynamic dominate. And so it's a kind of polluted environment that motivated us to start thinking about how we might channel these kinds of analytics into designing for new possibilities, in particular, where we would have spaces where listening deeply to one another, where the sharing of nuanced and reflective communications that were grounded in our everyday lives could actually have a chance to flourish. And rather than a divisive kind of space, could we create more constructive, more connective possibilities? And it's really these notions that roll up to our idea of when we talk about constructive communication, this is what we have in mind. So the approach that we're taking in this new center really has kind of three dimensions to the kind of tools and spaces that we think could lead to more constructive possibilities. The first is to observe that in today's social platforms, there's really an over-reliance on algorithmic solutions. AI drives the connections between humans. And so we envision instead platforms of the future that must optimize for human expertise and experience, with the AI actually creating power tools that serve people rather than the other way around. The second is that the dramatic shift of communications to online platforms really has led to platforms that are optimized for always-on addiction that underemphasize the impact and connection in real life. So we actually envision social tools of tomorrow that treat online and in-person offline life as totally intertwined and strive to maximize the benefit across these two. And finally, the power of the internet to allow global reach at light speed has led to an imposition of a kind of one-size-fits-all set of features to different communities, audiences, and people that fundamentally, our kind of social skills are designed for a different scale and different speed than the internet permits. And so we actually think it's critical to think about the design of platforms of tomorrow that harness the power of local connections and balance those with the diverse local needs with the raw scale that the internet will continue to deliver. And so it's really kind of these three elements that we weave together to design approaches to constructive communication. If you go to our website, you will find that there are many projects now, research projects that are underway at the center that draw on some of these different elements of our approach. I wanted today just highlight two to give you a kind of flavor of what's going on in the center. The first involves a partnership with Frontline, which is one of the premier documentary filmmakers in America in the public media system. And Frontline came to us a couple of years ago with a problem that their audience, which historically for decades has been politically balanced across the country, due to social media dynamics, in particular on Facebook, that they started to notice their audience was more and more leaning to the left, and they were losing their right-leaning audience, which was a problem for them, even though their audience was growing. They wanted to retain a kind of middle ground that could reach across diverse audiences. And so we developed an idea, which was going back to this sort of this picture of a fragmented social universe. Perhaps we could actually use machine learning to model nuances of how different groups are using words and phrases, potentially with hidden meaning in words, and channel those insights into creating some kind of a communication aid for the Frontline team to reach that more diverse audience that they were seeking. So here's what we did. Starting with, just to give you an example, and we could do this with any tweet, we're able to analyze the group of people who publicly retweet a given tweet and characterize the political sort of media preferences by looking at how each of those different individuals on Twitter, to what degree they follow different media sources, such as Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity, who represent two extremes of the political spectrum in American media. And by getting the distribution, we can actually summarize the political balance overall of the group of people who retweet with any piece of content that is on Twitter. And then here's where the machine learning comes in, that could we, with a large enough data set, in fact, we built a data set of over 100 million of these retweets across many different media sources, could we actually predict just from the text alone what the likely political balance would be? And indeed, we were able to train such a model, and we embedded it into a predictive writing tool. And this tool would allow the Frontline team to enter potential text for how they're describing a documentary and test and iterate really with machine learning and kind of human writing in a feedback loop to find language that was predicted to be maximally bridging, most likely to reach across political divides. And in fact, when we ran a field experiment, this is an example of one piece of text in an original piece of marketing that was rewritten by the frontline journalists, that when we ran A/B experiments, actual field tests of advertising campaigns on Twitter, we were able to, in a majority of the documentaries that we ran through this process, we were able to increase the diversity of reach for the frontline team. So this is just wanted to give you the first of two examples of bringing some machine learning together with, in this case, human writing to achieve this goal on the communication front. The second is a project called Local Voices Network, which is actually a collaboration between our center and Cortico, which is a nonprofit organization, which I actually co-founded and chair, that grew out of MIT and now works in cooperation with the center. The goal of Local Voices Network was to design a set of technologies and human practices to actually bring the ancient social practices of facilitated dialogue together with certain kinds of technology to create a new space for more constructive communication within communities. So we started by actually designing a new piece of hardware. This is the digital hearth, which can both record and play back high fidelity audio in face-to-face meetings or conversations, together with a controller designed for the facilitator, or what we call the host of the conversation, which includes some ability to help scaffold the facilitator to have a structured conversation with small groups. We designed a conversation structure, a kind of recipe for productive conversations by working with expert facilitators, and encoded that in a training process where we could then draw people together who are interested in learning the art and skill of hosting a conversation and learn both how to use the technology and this specific conversational format. And then we invited people from communities, and we actually launched in Madison, Wisconsin, and now we've grown and have had people from 28 states around the United States participate in these conversations. So we'd invite people in to have these conversations both in person and in a pandemic period now through Zoom, where we would host conversations that had these really powerful positive properties, that they were connected, where people were listening to one another and relating experiences, engaging with discomfort, and drawing out stories ultimately that you don't often hear in other public media settings, social media, talk radio, and so forth, while avoiding some of the negative attributes that tend to dominate in unfacilitated spaces. But while these conversations are taking place, we get explicit consent from all of the members of the conversation to go on public record as part of that conversation. And in the back end, we have developed tools. This is a tool built by Cortico that allows one to browse kind of like the score of a piece of music, who's speaking where, and to identify and explore different topics of interest, and actually drill down to very specific parts of conversations and go into the full transcript, listen to the audio if the person wishes, and then actually lift out pieces of conversations that seem to be worth noting and sharing, that can be tagged and then lifted out and shared through this tool. So we launched this this network in Madison, Wisconsin. And so as one group would have a conversation, the speech would be recorded. One of the interesting things the technology permits is that a second group can then play back a piece of audio that came from the first conversation, and it creates a way to bring voices from one conversation into another. We call this cross-pollination. And as this kind of a network of conversations evolves in a particular community, we end up with a public archive of these recordings. One of the things you can do is then work with local newsrooms to actually bring some of these conversations into the journalism process. And I'm just showing you a couple of examples here of news stories where that actually happened, where we actually embed audio from voices in the community. Finally, I just want to share an example recently completed of actually using this kind of network to help the Madison Police and Fire Commission bring community voices into the search for their new police chief. What you're going to see here is a very unusual public interview of one of the candidates for the police chief position, and then I'll explain to you how the Local Voices Network and the technology played a role. So here's one of the questions, and this was broadcast in December. You're seeing here Jackie Bogess. She is a member of the Police and Fire Commission interviewing Shone Barnes, who's one of the candidates who ultimately was sworn into the position.
It seems that police fear some of the communities they work in, and communities fear the police in return. What fears have you observed in the communities you police in, and what strategies might you deploy to help heal the harms that cause these fears?
So I believe that fear is a result of not understanding.
So what's remarkable is that question and several others that were put to the candidates in these public job interviews were actually the basis of a pattern analysis of voices from hundreds of people in these small group conversations. So the question was actually grounded in a thematic analysis that emerged from these voices. And the tool that I showed previously is available to members of the public to actually go back and interrogate and listen to the fuller context where those pieces of speech came from. So the result is actually an inclusive form of a public space where a durable voice record that is transparent and explorable and has these properties of mutual visibility create a kind of accountability to build trust in that the community is actually being heard in what turns out to be a very important and very contentious decision-making process. So there's various other research projects underway to map and analyze talk radio, to model using machine learning the impact of media diets on public opinion, to model audience networks through social network analyses, to do sense-making toolkits for communities and organizations, really building on some of the things I've shared, and designing new communication systems, be it for public health communication that we're testing now in Atlanta, or designing a totally new pro-social platform, a sort of alternative network for young teens. I just want to end by drawing out a connection with the theme of your meeting, thinking about the future of work. As we think about the implications of the workplace, an area we are now actively exploring is bringing several of the themes I touched on today and working in partnership with organizations such as large companies, where we can, number one, surface underheard voices within organizations. A lot of the tensions and fragmentation are, of course, spilling into organizations themselves. To analyze, just like we analyze the writing samples of Frontline, to analyze how organizations give voice, whether they're in their internal communications or external. And finally, to analyze public perception of organizations by looking at how in public media and social media people talk about the organization. So there's these three different communication sort of modes, and to then uncover and address misalignments between these. If we seek to build trust and have authenticity in organizations, we think it's very important to be able to understand where there are gaps between how people within the organization are speaking and expressing their values and perspectives, and how that is reflected or is failed to be reflected in the organization itself. And so that is work that we will be undergoing soon. Thank you so much for learning about the Center for Constructive Communication.
Well, thank you, Professor Roy. Some questions from our audience. What are the privacy implications of your work?
Privacy is a central question and concern in our work. Most of the work we do is either dealing with inherently public content, be it a broadcast piece of content on talk radio or on television or news, or sometimes, as you saw with the Local Voices Network, we will explicitly ask every member in a conversation to provide upfront consent that they are going on record because they want their voice to be captured. They want their story to be left in a durable record and then indexed and brought into various processes. When we work in more sensitive context, and maybe with a vulnerable member of a community, or it might be an organization where there are various legal and privacy concerns, we can take the same approach, the same tools and methods, but then work within those organizational boundaries to have secure and trusted ways to have that data retained and under control of the groups that want to use these methods.
A second question we have is, how do you address bias in AI algorithms?
That's really a great question. And as now more and more people understand, just because you have machine learning with large amounts of data certainly doesn't mean there are not problems in bias. In fact, there are always biases in any given human data set, whether it's linguistic or some kind of social graph, that will then be reflected in the models built by machine learning. So we do a couple of things to address this. First of all, we have active work in our group to work with interpretable and transparent models so that when there are biases, it's easier for the humans working with the technology to actually explore and investigate and surface those biases. The second is to really make it possible to go back to the original data and find alternative and complementary data to bring in corrective biases into the models. And finally, and we're still in early stages of this, is to also be mindful that, of course, we ourselves as researchers have our biases. And so we are very interested in building our tools so that they can be used not just by researchers and analysts sitting in our lab, but with our partners, be it community organizations or other organizations that are sort of our field partners. We want them to bring their own judgment and perspective to be able to then use these tools, detect those biases, and train alternate models with alternate data. So it really is an essential question and an area where we have to have engagement from human beings who are ultimately going to be using these tools to be able to reflect on them and iterate with the tools, the learning processes, and the data.
Someone in our audience wants to know, how does the center translate its research into practice?
You know, one of the really unique things about the Center for Constructive Communication is that we're actually bringing together researchers, PhD students, faculty, postdocs, research scientists, on one hand, together with what we call a prototyping workshop, where we have software engineers and product designers and program managers that come together and can actually translate some of the research that is happening in the research lab side into advanced prototypes that are ready for extended field pilots. And with our program management team, we build collaborations with external community organizations, with companies, with municipalities, to actually take some of these advanced prototypes, put them into the field, run extended real-world experiments, and bring the insights back into revising both the prototypes and informing the selection of new research questions that we had not even realized matter until we did the field work. So it's this coupling between research, a workshop where we can actually engineer robust tools, and our outside collaborators, our field pilot partners, that together create a community where we're able to take and seamlessly bring research into the field and bring the insights back into our research.